Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Chris, and I am the creative lead and content manager here at Mobile Live. Now, I'm a creative by trade, which means that I don't understand technology as well as about 95% of my colleagues. And that's okay, because one of the things I love about working here is that I not only get to produce and market content on the ever-changing world of tech and digital, but in order to do that effectively, I also need to have a little understanding of it. Normally, in order to do that, I would pester one of my colleagues who would be gracious enough to share some insight. And these usually lead to some pretty interesting and enlightening conversations. So when recently tasked with producing some new content that would require a little expertise from a colleague, I thought I'd up the ante a little bit. And instead of just having the conversation, I thought I'd record it. And instead of just asking one colleague, I'm asking three. That's because despite what the name might suggest, we have a pretty big topic today: microservices. As enterprises continue to make the shift to DevOps and explore different ways of becoming more agile, microservices are continually becoming one of the most sought after means of development. And rather than get theoretical, I thought we'd get practical in understanding this topic, which is why I'll be speaking to a very specific group of colleagues today. Now, to better understand microservices, you need a lot of perspectives. You need the perspective of the developers who create them and the business side that drives them. You need men and women who haven't just read about them or worked on them in isolation, but have actually had boots on the ground in a variety of client locations on dozens and dozens of projects that span multiple industries, and more importantly, have driven successful results. Our guests have encountered the real challenges and overcome them successfully, and today they will share some of that experience with all of you. Introducing Shalini, a software engineer and developer. We have Manish, our Director of Development, and lastly, we've got Naresh, our Director of Strategy and Architecture. Now, there's a lot of varied perspective here today, collectively more than 35 years of experience. So let's just jump right into it, shall we? So Shalini, please tell me a little bit about what you do and your current experiences working with microservices.
When you talk about the experience regarding the microservices, it's been a vast one because I've been working with microservices almost for 4-5 years, you can say, across the different sectors, across different projects. The projects involved kind of legacy, like the digital transformation, moving the entire code from the legacy to the microservice architecture. The other projects involved like starting from the scratch, new projects, building from a basic like designed microservice architecture. Yeah, that is the pretty much experience so far.
Okay. Any challenges that you typically encounter in your day-to-day while working with them?
First of all, major challenge is the data synchronization. So when you actually work with the event-driven kind of system, now earlier you have one microservice, one big legacy code, right? Now you have divided them into smaller microservices. Now, when you actually try to transfer the data across the microservice with the event-driven pattern, you actually lose some data in between. So you have to be very careful about the data synchronization. The other thing is actually tracking end-to-end of any call. Now the call is going across the microservices. So you have to take care of the tracking ID across different microservices, I would say. Yeah, that's one of the challenge for the logging and tracking. The other, you can say, there's the maintenance part. Earlier, one big team was managing the application, so they had the complete ownership over it. Now what happens? Everything is divided into smaller microservices. Now who should actually take the ownership? Who should go ahead and manage the change management there? That's a big concern, right?
That's a really big question. So who should own microservices then?
Because this is not a one solution for all, right? So you have to take an example of different organizations because we have different sectors working in a different mode. You can take an example of an agile world where the team is comprised from the solution to the developers to the testing team and to the production support. That's entire team. So ideally, they should take the ownership. When you move on to the another organization who actually have kind of an experience with just the, let's say, the operation team, the production support team, along with their own developers team. They should take the responsibility once the development team hand over the project to them. So it's a different things across the different environments, across the different challenges of the organizations. So it's not a one solution for all.
Okay. Any challenges that you typically encounter in your day-to-day while working with them?
First of all, major challenge is the data synchronization. So when you actually work with the event-driven kind of system, now earlier you have one microservice, one big legacy code, right? Now you have divided them into smaller microservices. Now, when you actually try to transfer the data across the microservice with the event-driven pattern, you actually lose some data in between. So you have to be very careful about the data synchronization. The other thing is actually tracking end-to-end of any call. Now the call is going across the microservices. So you have to take care of the tracking ID across different microservices, I would say. Now, that's one of the challenge for the logging and tracking. The other, you can say, this is the maintenance part. Earlier, one big team was managing the application, so they had complete ownership over it. Now what happens? Everything is divided into smaller microservices. Now who should actually take the ownership? Who should go ahead and manage the change management there? That's a big concern, right, to raise.
That's a really big question. So who should own microservices then?
That's a tricky question because this is not a one solution for all, right? So you have to take an example of different organizations because we have different sectors working in a different mode. You can take an example of an agile world where the team is comprised from the solution to the developers to the testing team and to the production support. That's the entire team. So ideally, they should take the ownership. When you move on to the another organization who actually have kind of an experience with just the, let's say, the operation team, the production support team, along with their own developers team. They should take the responsibility once the development team hand over the project to them. So it's a different things across the different environments, across the different challenges of the organizations. So it's not a one solution for all.
Manish, what are your inputs on this?
So if I talk about the legacy industry, in 20 years back, we used to work like that. We have one development team, and then there is some production support team who take over. But the ownership is remained with the operation team. Now with the new world of Agile, it's changing a lot. Because now we are saying it, okay, the Agile team is comprised of everything from business to DevOps to developer. So in that scenario, if possible, Agile team should own the microservices.
Naresh, do you agree with that? Should the Agile team own microservices?
Before I go into like, okay, who should own the microservices, I would say that, okay, are we going to reuse the microservices? Are we going to dependent on the microservices, or each team is going to create their own microservices, right? So if we address that in a right way, then we can definitely say, okay, you know what, this team should own it, or there should be an owner for the microservices versus there should be a subscribers or consumers of that microservices that are using them, right? So I would say yes, there should be a reusable capability in microservices, and we can definitely use the framework like DRY, right, which do not repeat yourself, which basically says that, or the philosophy of it is do it once and do it so that you can capture all the information in one place. So kind of dictating that, okay, you know what, we should use or create one microservice where most of the other teams are subscribed and consuming that microservice.
How do you feel about that, Shalini? Do you agree with that it's
Again, it depends upon the situation because it's two sides of the coin, right? One, actually the situation comes in when you actually created one microservices, and tomorrow if somebody else wants to come and make a change to it, now who should actually make a change? Is it the original team who should be making it the change, or the new person has the flexibility of doing it? It again depends upon the organization. If they have set up quite a good team which sees, okay, we are in a position of doing the changes or driving the changes, basically, yes, they can take full ownership, and everybody who wants to come and use it, yes, they have to come and give them the features or the bug, and the original team should take it. If you think about a different perspective of it, this has a foundation limited to that particular team only. But tomorrow you need to have a flexibility out of it. You might have common libraries that are being used across the microservices. You don't want to be dependent upon one team at that time, but you have to follow the best practices, right? You have to follow the proper provisionings of that microservice. You have to go ahead and check the backward compatibility of that. So a lot of scenarios comes into picture.
Would there ever be any situations, and I understand it's a case by case basis, but are there any situations you can think of where perhaps the ownership might be in question or debated between certain teams, where it might not be so clear?
Yeah, a lot of times. Because there are few organizations who are recently just moving to the microservice architecture, right? So somewhere you have that legacy mindset in picture, and so, when you are actually trying to move ahead with a microservice architecture point, you have to change that mindset. Earlier, one complete team was taking the ownership because it's a legacy code. One team was maintaining it, everything was going fine with it. Now, multiple teams have started working on that same code, splitting them into the microservices. Now again the fight arises, okay, I have created that microservice, should I own it till the end? Till the end means entire life cycle, right? So there have been a time with me as well, like I created one microservices which was actually being used across the, I would say across the other microservice environments. And I somehow, after some time, I actually moved to a different team. Now the problem started coming when somebody wants to make a new change in that common library. He started asking me of making the change. I said, no, it's a common one. You should actually go ahead and make that change on your own because you understand it. Now, somehow they did it in a way that they didn't check the backward compatibility of it. They created a separate version out of it, but didn't check the backward compatibility, which actually broke the flow. So I have to come into the picture again, and then they started questioning the ownerships. Now after that they realized, okay, this is not a one-person job, right? No one person can take the ownership. You have to make a certain principles, you have to make certain documentations and responsibility chart. How the flow should actually go, because this way you cannot work ahead. Because now you are into the world of microservices. There are going to be lots and lots of microservices to manage. Yeah, so that's one of the times we face that issue.
So, wow. Do you agree, Manish?
The biggest challenge in the organization, or we say in the current world of microservice, is what is microservice? I will call one API as a microservice, one function call as a microservice. So there are some guidelines about this, which we call the domain-driven design, and which talk about the bounded context. So as a part of bounded context, you need to define what is your boundary of the microservice. What is the unit of work you want to define and call this as a one service, which can be worked independently, right? And once we define that, that's where the most of the problem will solve. Because once you define the boundary of the microservices, you know what type of input you are sending it and what type of output you are expecting it. And that could be a contract. We call in the IT world, it is called a contract, right? The same as lawyer term. So what is saying that whoever is owning the microservice or whoever is designing the microservice, they are publishing a contract that when you give me this type of input, I'm going to return you this type of output.
Okay.
And that's where in the today's world, the new concept of contract testing is pretty much is coming into picture. Because we see this challenge, what like Shalini says about we face the challenge. Let's say if I have a one microservice which is used across multiple projects, and either every project want to use it or they want to modify something, they want to enhance it. There is many use cases which we can cover, but the challenge will remain there. Who will take a priority? Who will make a change? Thus, one change impact another project. Thus, if I'm changing the one microservice, what will happen to all the projects which are using it for years, right? Mm-hmm. And we need to make sure about that we don't impact that. To solve this thing, we have to come up with the good guidelines, okay, about standard input and output. We also need to work with the set up some type of architecture board guideline which talk about how we can define the microservice. What is the design pattern we are going to use with microservice? So if one team is developed and they are no longer in the organization or they move to the other project, the design principle is same. So anybody who has an understanding of organization design principle, they can come up and take up the ownership of that microservice and continue working on it. without impacting too much to other people.
You mentioned architecture, and I'm glad you did. It's a good segue here. For Naresh, from an architecture perspective, why would you suggest microservices to a client?
It's a very good question. So I see that anytime a new technology trend comes in and everybody wants to jump on it and they want to abuse it, right? So and microservice is a trend that every single use case that or every single organization that want to digitize in some way or form wants to develop it in microservice, right? So one of the key thing that we see is that is the microservice the right solution that can be fit in here, right? So and definitely with no doubt it is a modern deployment that can be done in most of our cloud environments, right? So when you want to use Docker containers or Kubernetes, but before we get into that we are recommending microservices, we would first ask ourselves, are they dealing with huge amount of data? Is SLA very, very critical? And the code that we're going to develop, is it going to be significantly large compared to a monolithic applications, right? So based on those factors, then we would say, for this kind of use cases, we see that the data is going to be huge, or you need to have a better SLA. So we would definitely recommend microservices, right? So like if you think of examples like let's say when you're creating a machine learning models, or when you're doing a large scale ETL transformation from one database to another one. So these are like high level cases that where we say, I think this is where microservice fit in very well. And if they don't have a lot of complex data to deal with, then we would even recommend to go with monolithic application.
So you wouldn't always so microservices aren't the end all be all. It really is on a case by case kind of basis.
Definitely, Chris. Like I would always argue that why would we want to develop an architecture that is much more complex than the monolithic architecture, because it requires a certain kind of discipline in order to design, build, and deploy it. So I would always argue that before you choose a certain technology or a framework, we need to see what is our business case for that.
Saw you nodding in agreement over there, Shalini. It's one of the advantages of these video conferences. What are your thoughts on that?
If you talk, I agree with Naresh on this point. It's not a one solution for everybody, for sure, because when you are actually trying to go it, so solution architect basically give them an idea, this fits in your microservice architecture and this doesn't fit. And the other factor which comes into picture is really the organization ready for it? Because it has to come not just with that piece of a code, it has to come with lots of other overheads. It might be operation overheads, then ownership as well, then different teams working on it, skill set as well, discipline and writing the code as well. Do you have that expertise of doing it? So there are lots of points that will actually affect the decision of actually going ahead with the microservice architecture or not. That's what basically driving factors for us. Because yes, they can say, it's actually a good solution, but they don't have a ready operation team for maintaining that much overhead on it, because it's no more a one application, right? It's smaller applications, and you have to see a lot of things along with it.
What about you, Manish?
Yeah, so there is no one medicine to the one disease, right? We have multiple options, right? We have so I don't restrict myself that I'm a Microservice service developer, or I'm a serverless developer, or I'm a monolithic application developer. We live in the world of the polyglot deployments, polyglot application. So when I will say the polyglot, I talk about we ourselves don't restrict with one language, one technology, or one architecture. We adopt ourselves with the client's need and the client's maturity model what is the best fitted for that client. It could be monolithic application, it could be microservices, it could be a serverless, right? Or it could be a mix of all three. For the different scenario, we can go with some service as a monolithic application, or some application as a part of the puzzle as monolithic, some which we want to manage as a services, or we want to reuse a lot, we can deploy as a microservice. And the some function which we say it is an event driven, or we want to make it a cost effective, or we want to make it concise and precise, we can do as a serverless also, which we just create one function which you do unit of work, and once event is coming, is performing its part, once its end is done, its process die, we don't need to pay for anything, right? So I myself believe that we need to be more mature. We need to think about what is a client's actual need is, okay? And it is a group decision, right? It's not like one person, one architecture is coming up with the say, oh, we have to go with it. It all based on the collective model. Everybody need to come together and ask the right question. Okay, why we need to go with microservice? Why we need to go with the serverless? Okay, it's not a train which you have to just jump and you need to reach to destination. You can take a bus sometimes. You can walk. It's good for your health. Also, we always, even when you choose the microservice, you should always start with monolithic application. Choose one thing, start with the big, and then once your project or your agile team reach a certain point that you know what is your boundaries of the services, then you divide it. It takes less time, and you will be pretty much have a good your bounded context when you go in this way also. So in some of our projects, we also did that. We start with monolithic, so we can understand all the requirement, we can implement, we can see how it works. And then once we reach in the middle of the project and we reach to the certain point of maturity that we are okay with our solution and the design, then we divide the application based on the what we think can be reusable, or what we think should be the standard input and output, and can be go as a service. So that's another approach people can take.
To what Manish said in terms of reusing or how the change should be managed, especially when you are looking at the microservices, the real value can be harvested when we actually reuse them or reuse between multiple teams, right? So one of the key principle that I was trying to highlight before, right? So definitely we need to think about how we actually capture all the information that is needed as a part of the code itself, rather than trying to create a document and then there is a code that is lying there, and you have a document that is explaining the code, and at some point the documentation is kind of outdated, right? So I just want to reiterate the point that we should try as much as to capture all the information and all the documentations that is needed as a part of the code itself. That would also help in managing managing the microservices.
Another point to it. So when you say talk about capturing everything in the code, then there are certain scenarios. For example, you have to actually document it somewhere, the traceability. For example, one microservice is being used by 10 other microservices. Sometimes you are not even aware of anybody who actually used it without informing your team about it. Tomorrow, you are not aware of them, right? You go ahead as per your knowledge, you make that change, it's all fine. But somehow it affected the other team who didn't inform you that they are trying to use your microservice. So you lose that context there. So somehow you have to manage the whole, I would say the whole diagram, who is actually dependent upon who and who is.
So, Shalini, to that point, I definitely agree that is needed. But if you consider using service discoveries to definitely decouple those services from each other, so that would actually make you kind of let your consumers connect, discover and connect to your service endpoints, right? So in that way, we don't have to necessarily maintain all the relationship. Instead, there is a service provider and there is a consumer who is consuming it, and and to make it as much as decoupled as possible, then you don't need to have that kind of complexity in there.
Maybe we have kind of a pub sub model in that case. If somebody is dependent upon us, they should actually get notified, right? When you're trying to publish a new version of it.
Yeah.
We should not be lost in that whole world. That happened to me in one of the projects actually. So that's one of the outcome of that. So we actually try to reuse somebody's code which they were not aware of. We go ahead and make that change and it broke our stuff.
Do you get offended when somebody reuses your code without telling you? Is it like your little sister borrowing your sweater and they didn't tell you?
No, it was a nightmare for us. Like we were all delivered the project, everything working perfectly fine, and next day somebody made a change to the production code. Okay, we are screwed.
Yeah. That was a great conversation, but unfortunately that is all the time we have. I wanted to thank Shalini, Manish, and Naresh for taking the time out of their busy schedules to talk with me today. What I found most interesting about today's conversation was when it came to who should own microservices, and really the answer isn't one person. With so many people involved in such a varied life cycle, potential for handoff, the question simply isn't as straightforward as you hoped. Fortunately, I think the answer just boils down to approach. The benefits that come with using microservices are clear, and we're never being debated today. However, the approach on how to ensure that you get and continue to experience these benefits aren't as clear. And to echo and paraphrase the words of my colleagues, it's because there really is no one successful approach to microservices. Rather, each instance is unique. An approach should be determined by the type of organization you're dealing with, how it's structured, what are the specifications of the project, its expected lifecycle, are the microservices to be reused, and have you followed best practices?